Byline audio. Byline audio.
Well, hello and welcome to Byline Times Live, where we are covering Vote Watch 24. You know what we want to talk about. I'm Peter Jukes, co-founder of Byline Times, and I'm joined in the studio by our great editor, Hardeep Matharu, and our chief reporter, Josiah Mortimer. So we'll be talking a bit about this presidential debate between Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer, the two major political party leaders last night, and the whole weird thing called the spin room. It's an American import. It's the idea that we come and hear politicians tell us who was up, who's down, and basically are spun to, which I find fascinating. We'll also be looking at some of the other spin in the actual debate, particularly this contentious £2,000 tax lie, shall we call it? It seems to be that. Whether or not that's effective, whether these kind of high-profile, let me say, economies with the truth actually serve the purposes of those who have served them up. A bit like the battle bus, if you remember, £350 million to the NHS during the Vote Leave campaign. We'll also be looking at the return of none other than Nigel Farage. Yes, he's taken over the leadership of the Reform Party and he's running in Clacton. What is going on there? Why did that happen? What is the Reform Party? Is it a party? Is it a company? And who is this mysterious advisor to Nigel Farage, otherwise known as George Cottrell, Posh George, who advises on finances? A very interesting character indeed. Anyway, now to the spin room. Josiah, you were there. Hot foot back from Manchester, was it?
Yeah.
What was it like?
It was extremely bizarre. You have this, just to paint a picture, so the media was all clustered together in the Coronation Street viewing experience. So it's basically you had the debate in the other side of Media City, on the other side of the river, and then we were in this big room in the Coronation Street experience. So we went past the Rovers Return pub as we went upstairs.
Was it open? Was it open?
Sadly not. We couldn't nip in for a cheeky half at the advert break. So you're all sitting in this room. We weren't actually in the debate room itself. So we've got this big telly in front of us and all screens all around. And then at the back, there's broadcasters before the debate starts in the couple of hours before then, trying to nab politicians that are wandering in. So you had a BBC zone, GB News zone, Sky zone, and then there were some people filming outside as well.
Byline Times zone? No.
Well, I mean,
you were the zone.
That was the zone of one. Yeah. And it was just extremely strange, really. And you had lots of Labour people there, lots of Labour shadow ministers. Jonathan Ashworth, Labour's shadow DWP minister, he was wandering around with this briefing that Labour had done, handing it out to everyone saying, I'm going to be watching like a hawk while this debate's going on with my calculator sat at the back. Repeating this line probably about 20 times to any journalist that would hear it, obviously trying to get them to write that down. And not many Tories around, very, very thin on Tories.
Who came from the Conservative Party?
So just before the debate started, Michael Gove popped his head in.
And he's leaving Parliament anyway, isn't he? So.
Well, indeed, yeah. And weirdly, he's being put forward as one of the main Conservative spokespeople during this election campaign, despite fleeing what many would describe as a sinking ship. So, yeah, he popped his head in and said, there'll be no spin from me. It will just be the unvarnished truth.
Oh, wow. So that's like, there's some famous enigma with Socrates. If a liar tells you he's telling the truth, is he lying? So the unvarnished truth from Michael Gove. But maybe that's his biography when he leaves.
Maybe.
Autobiography.
In the, much like Pravda was just the truth, I'm sure. But then, the debate started, carried on much as normal, except when politicians said stuff that was pretty unbelievable. There was great laughter. There was also a lot of laughter from the audience last night, of course, as well, when Rishi Sunak claimed that NHS waiting lists were coming down and on his plan for Rwanda. And then afterwards, there's basically about 2 hours where journalists just sort of wander around and little clusters form where there'll be, for example, the Energy Secretary, Claire Coutinho, or Victoria Atkins, the Health Minister. And you just sort of wander around and you think, okay, who's that standing there? Oh, right, it's the Energy Secretary trying to say that Rishi Sunak performed amazingly during the debate. Very odd. And Wes Streeting. There's literally a point where Wes Streeting, Labour's Shadow Health Secretary, was within about probably a foot of Michael Gove. Michael Gove doing TV interviews and Wes Streeting with his headphones on doing BBC Down the Line, of course, saying completely the opposite things. But yeah, it does just illustrate what a strange setup it is. Both saying their leaders did remarkable jobs.
Josiah, do you feel that spin room contributed in any way to the public's understanding of the leaders' debate or any of the issues around it? I mean, what I'm trying to get at is, forgive me for being naive, but what's the point of this spin room?
I mean, it quite literally is just to get the party's snap responses to what was said at the debate. And But of course, they're never going to say their leaders did a bad job. What you're really looking for is, on the journalist side, I think, is the chance to maybe spot weaknesses and probe where the leadership figures or PM hopefuls floundered. So there was a point last night, I don't know if you remember, where Keir Starmer expressed that he was open to overseas processing of migrants. And there were a lot of journalists asking, well, okay, has he said that before? Turns out he has said that before. But it looks like there was a bit of a shift there from the Labour leader in terms of being a bit more open to that. There was the speculation, right, that would be open to something like a Rwanda-style plan. Instead, when I asked questions of Labour spokesperson afterwards, he said, no, it would be more like people not having to cross the channel and being able to apply for asylum in British embassies in places like Turkey or France or Egypt. So that offered a little bit more clarity, I suppose, but much of the rest of it was just saying Rishi Sunak trounced Keir Starmer. It was clear Starmer was rattled. And then, of course, the exact opposite from the Labour side.
So what this reminds me of, Hardeep, is sports commentary. We had the great Jay Rosen, professor, New York University, who has dissected the way that, especially in American coverage, and it's an American import, the spin room, it's done who's up, who's down. It's like horse racing, isn't it? And this reminds me of the dugout. When you're watching a football match, you go to Gary Lineker or somebody talking about, well, they did really well, or the manager's got to do that. It's back to this, the odds of up and down rather than the stakes and what's really at stake. Did it remind you of that? By the way, if you want to read more about that, our interview with him is on bylinesupplement.com.
It did. Even the notion of this spin room, I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but I can't remember that being a thing in itself, even in the last general election.
I think it started the last generation, yeah, but it was very marginal.
Very marginal, and I guess it just lends itself more to the notion that the entire election campaign in this country, I mean, it's been going this way for some years, but it is more and more a presidential style process. So even the fact that it was billed as Sunak versus Starmer, there was something about the terminology that I just thought was so reductionist. And again, it's all about the personalities of these two people, insofar as who's going to land the punch, who's going to say the soundbite that's going to be memorable. Why is it so much about the personalities, the people, the names, and how well they've done or not? Because they're representatives of their parties, they're the leaders of their parties, and they should be there discussing the issues. But I just felt the entire thing has more and more of a presidential style nature. And I really don't feel it is that illuminating for people who need to get clear answers on what is going on.
Before we get to the actual substance, or one of the big substances of the debate, rather deceptive figure perhaps, it may be with the comparison you're making is with WWF, World Wrestling Federation, where it's all kind of a bit staged, all feels a bit confected. Now, interesting enough, The Sun commissioned a poll, which unfortunately for them showed Starmer had won by 20%, right? So they went with the YouGov poll, I think. I might not have this the right way around. There was another poll which specifically asked the audience to forget who they actually support and say he'd done better. It was kind of like equal, right? So it is this weird refraction where you're asking people who's performed over 1 hour. This isn't running a government. This isn't actually enacting policies. It's like a wrestling foundation.
Well, the entire format of these debates, I think they're really problematic, actually, because I'm just not sure how much they're illuminating anything for voters. Each question, when it was first posed to both Starmer and Sunak, they had 45 seconds.
45 seconds.
To answer. I mean, what's going on? 45 seconds, and then they could follow up, but it was often in response to what the other person had tossed their way.
Yeah.
And watching it, I mean, obviously there were people in the audience who have thought about their questions and were asking them, but often they weren't being answered in any straight way, not really. And I don't know, I drew this comparison during the COVID briefings when Matt Hancock and Boris Johnson and whoever else were trying to inform apparently the public about what was going on during the pandemic. And again, those briefings seem to me more about the government justifying the policies that it was implementing and its lack of competence and speediness in taking action than it was really about illuminating the public. And I called it sort of the hyper-normalization of our politics. And so this notion that we're watching this debate where we're sitting there knowing that they've got 45 seconds. What are we really going to learn in that? We know that they're offering sound bites. We know that this is a presidential style thing. We know they're not really going to answer the questions of the audience in any substantial way. The audience members know that. We know that. And the journalists in the spin room and the politicians there, they're all bought into that. And it's just a very funny thing that we all go along with, but it doesn't really shed any light. And I think the notion of journalism done in this 45-second soundbite, especially when it comes to elections, is deeply problematic. And, I just think we need to really look at that. I'm sure it will happen. I'm sure there'll be detailed interviews as well with Sunak and Starmer. But I'm just not sure what it really helped with. And if anything, it's now created more headlines about this £2,000 tax rise.
Let's get to that.
That causes more issues.
Yes, because this is a very important thing. Before we do that, really what you're talking about is performance. It's performative. Just to highlight people, it's still in the shops, fantastically edited by Hardeep, written by Josiah with some input from me. This is the edition Theatre of Cruelty about the performative cruelty of the Sunak administration. So we're looking at a kind of weird sports performance valued in the spin room like a sports performance. But let's look at one of the goals or own goals. Tell me about this £2,000 figure and the origin of that from Rishi Sunak.
Yeah, so it was repeated almost ad nauseum by Rishi Sunak, this claim that Labour are going to hike taxes by £2,000 per person, even when Labour win the general election. The assumption was almost in Sunak's voice that they would win the general election. And there was quite a while when Keir Starmer didn't really seem to put it down. He sort of rolled his eyes a little bit, and it almost felt as if he just didn't want to engage with it. We learned from the Treasury Permanent Secretary that the figure that Sunak was claiming came from civil servants. They shouldn't claim that at all. And the head of the Treasury was basically saying it was wrong for Rishi Sunak to claim that. Why? Because the assumptions that went into that all came from Conservative special advisors, and then basically telling Treasury permanent staff to say, work out what these assumptions would mean for the taxpayer. Of course, those civil servants are employed by the government. They do have a duty of impartiality, but as Labour was saying afterwards, you put garbage in, you get garbage out. And as I say, Keir Starmer didn't really put it down very quickly, but perhaps that's because they knew that this story was coming out, which I think has basically shown that what Rishi Sunak was saying, if it wasn't a lie, it was certainly a falsehood, this claim that this stat was impartial. Worth
adding, and I think even The Spectator, hardly a friend of the Labour Party, has picked this up, that under the Conservative proposals, they go up £3,000, 3,000 the next year.
But even though, as Josiah rightly says, that Labour may have had a strategy to rebut this misleading statement after the event, and now, especially on social media, there's been a lot of marketing pumped out by the Labour Party saying Rishi Sunak is a liar. I just want to take a step back because outside of our bubble of being in the media and outside of the bubble of people who are interested in politics and very engaged and interested, if we just look at the general public, what they're now going to be seeing is, from the Labour Party's point of view, they have to do this, but they're now seeing a whole load of social media banners saying Rishi Sunak's a liar. And the reason I'm bringing this up is if we're looking at democracy as a whole and how the corrosive nature of how it's being conducted is having an impact on people's engagement with it. This all contributes to the fact that Labour has had to rebut something misleading by calling him a liar. And people who are not that engaged will, liar, they're all liars. They're liars. Yes. Starmer's probably lying, and then he had to call him a liar. Yeah. And it's this debate. I mean, who does this really serve? It
brings politics into disrepute. And I mean, let's be fair, it seems to have been started by the Conservatives on this point. And of course, for us who, Byline Times in a way came out of the Brexit debate, or they performed at the famous Vote Leave battle bus, will save £350 million a week. It wasn't that to be a member of the EU, and we'll spend it on the NHS. And, well, there's some argument around that, but it doesn't look like it's been spent effectively. So the guy who came up with that lie, the battle bus lie, let's call it that, it was a lie on various levels. It was Dominic Cummings, former head of campaigns for Vote Leave and then became Boris Johnson's chief advisor. He said it was an act of genius because even as they rebutted it, Remain campaign rebutted, they were talking about what he wanted them to talk about, the costs of the EU, more money spent on the NHS. Now, several people are arguing that this lie, halfway around the world before Truth has got his boots on, it's also halfway around the world even when it's being shot down, flying around and everybody's talking about it. So do you think this is another example of the legacy of Brexit and the horrible force of lies?
Yeah, and that was partly why I suspected that Keir Starmer was uncertain about engaging with it at all, because of this idea. It's that idea of don't think of an elephant, right? If you say that instantly, so don't think of £2,000.
Oh, God.
Instantly you're thinking, well, 2,000, and then of course that's all everyone's talking about. So I did think, there is a tactical decision, I think, to be made here. I completely agree with Hardeep, though. It has just toxified the whole debate. Before this came out last week, we had a warning from the UK Statistics Authority, basically calling on parties to be careful with how they use statistics this election period. Of course, that's been completely ignored. I mean, Labour aren't immune on this either, because, as I said, Jonathan Ashworth was handing out his own Labour dossier last night that was built on many Labour assumptions while he critiqued the Conservatives one. Now, they weren't entirely equal, but they basically said that the Tories have unfunded spending commitments of £71 billion over, I think, the next Parliament. Much of that was just off-the-cuff comments from people like Jeremy Hunt saying, oh, well, I think inheritance tax should be abolished. And also this claim that national insurance might be abolished by the end of the next Parliament. Neither of those are firm manifesto pledges. We haven't even seen the manifesto yet, but of course both sides are already making out that these things are carved in stone. So there's a lot of heat and not much light, I think, so far.
So there's kind of a race to the bottom, isn't there? There's Gresham's law, I think, in currency. Once you start tampering with the currency, putting base metals in the coinage, it all starts going to base metals. But Hardeep, I mean, we're particularly focused on Byline Times, aren't we? On, if you like, we're outside the system. We look at journalism covering politics. And there has been some pushback. I've noticed Lewis Goodall wrote a rather good tweet thread on X, I prefer to call it Twitter, about how you shouldn't celebrate these lies. Following the point you're making, it debases the whole political currency. But there's a great line by Jay Rosen again, who has got this piece on Byline Supplement, who's coming to Byline Festival just after and during the election result night and the weekend afterwards. And he says this kind of dialogue where they say, oh, well, they lie to us because the lie gets told. And they're telling the public this, right? Journalists are making us connoisseurs of our own bamboozlement, which is a great line. This is kind of like your hypernormalization thing. Journalists are sort of winking at the audience going, you're falling for this or you're not falling. It's a very bizarre position to be in as a journalist, to celebrate these lies.
Yes, I think it's wrong. I just don't think that's the duty of journalists, to be wrapped up in, oh, well, this is part of the strategy, essentially. That's how it's being framed. Well, it's misleading, but that is the political strategy. And there's more time and analysis given to it as a political strategy than it is actually dissecting how true is this claim. The Conservative Party has repeated it since on social media. So they're standing by it. Labour is obviously saying it's false
We're all talking
and
about
misleading.
it. And 2000, look, let's be clear. For them, it's a joke. 350 million. The sad thing was, wasn't it? We did a movie called Brexit, The Betrayal, which you watch on Byline TV. One of the people interviewed in that movie was a woman who voted Leave, who has two quite sick children, who really thought 350 million was going to be spent on the NHS.
Yeah, so they're not even thinking about
2,000 on your tax bill is a big difference to most people, normal people.
But that's what I mean when Rishi Sunak makes such a claim in that the context of a debate that's very presidential, that is about sound bites and 45-second answers. I don't think he's thinking about the public, and that is really problematic. The other thing that's really interesting about this is what isn't getting asked. So there's not one question on Brexit, its impact, not the notion of whether we need to have another referendum or was it right to have Brexit. Just in terms of the future,
there wasn't one. I didn't
and the
see
impact.
the debate.
There was no question on it, and it wasn't even mentioned in terms of why the cost of living crisis has escalated and Britain's place in the world.
Exports, imports, what? But
and
hold
what
on.
was striking was on BBC Newsnight at 10:30. Piers Morgan was one of the commentators on with Victoria Derbyshire, analysing the leaders' debate. And Piers Morgan pointed it out and said
Yes.
there was no mention of Brexit.
He was quite good,
and
wasn't he,
even
on Question
went,
Time?
yeah, and on Newsnight he even said, well, I think maybe Labour should look at public opinion and how it has swung towards having another referendum, possibly. And when Piers Morgan is the one pointing this out,
yes, you've got
that. I mean, what
that's
does that
canary
say?
in the mine there.
But this wasn't commented on. It's just interesting.
Yeah.
So I ask you this, Josiah, why wasn't that raised? So what we have is a spin room, we have this program, which all these rules, and you saw the sausage being made. The leaders must have agreed there is a conspiracy of silence, therefore, between most of the major parties. We won't mention Brexit if you don't. The Conservatives don't want to mention it anymore. They led on the last election, 2019, got the 80-seat majority on Get Brexit Done. They don't want to lead on it because it's not been very good got done, right? Labour don't want to lead on it. I suppose they don't want to reactivate the Brexit identity wars that made the North, the Red Wall fall for them.
But you're right, Peter, before we come to Josiah. It's not that there wasn't even a question about it that was selected by ITV. I don't think either of the leaders even mentioned it.
Yeah. But ITV also
that's the
didn't
point,
select a
isn't it?
question on that. That's extraordinary.
Yeah, I think it's entered, unfortunately, the realm of it being the status quo, and it stops being thought about by the media class and the political class at all. So despite the massive negative impact it's had on our economy, it's just taken as a given now. And I think that's an issue when you only have two political parties there, because of course, we live in a country with devolution, SNP being in government in Scotland, Northern Ireland having its own government. None of these voices really had much of a look in last night. Now, there are 7-party leaders debates coming. Whether within an hour you can actually get any more info on this, probably doubtful, but it does suggest that the format is, I think, quite lacking. I think, and others have suggested this as well, it might be better, possibly instead of doing these things, is to have really forensic interviews with the leaders themselves. So rather than just saying, right, you've got your 45 seconds, you have a question, and then when they don't answer it, which let's face it, they often don't, they are nailed down and tied down on what exactly they mean by it. And I do think that would probably add something that you don't get with these head-to-heads.
So on the Brexit thing, we know it isn't over. It's ongoing. We have more border controls, especially border controls on imports and exports, phytosanitary. It's going to get much tougher. And on holidaymakers, people traveling to Europe, they're going to have special queues. Going to be huge because we've got to have all these biometric testing. Now, who was the key figure pushing for Brexit? We should start discussing now. Who's returned to the scene, having said he'd go to America, had done his work. Nigel Farage, whose Brexit party as he ran under the last election, and UKIP the elections before, has run for a seat in Parliament. I think he's never gained one. He announced this week he'd be standing in Clacton, which, as polls would show, is one, if we'd like to say in a not a pejorative way, one of the more Brexity seats in the UK. Vote has strong Leave vote. He's standing there. Now, just before we go to the details of the Reform Party, very interesting party, if it could be called that, and some of his aide-de-camp, what is Nigel Farage standing on the platform of? He's got his Brexit. Is it just not good enough? Wants another Brexit? He certainly doesn't want to rejoin. Hardeep or Josiah, can you tell me what his platform is?
It is interesting that the Reform Party are also within the conspiracy of silence on Brexit. They don't really seem to want to talk about it either. I mean, Nigel Farage is talking, obviously, a huge amount about immigration, which has soared under the Conservatives and soared
under
after
Brexit.
Yeah, exactly. So I think he's viewing it as I think he's admitted this before, that Brexit has been a failure.
Yeah.
Now, he would say it's been a failure under the Conservatives. Remainers would say it's been a failure, full stop. But yeah, immigration is the number one issue that Reform are going after, partly because we have such a warped media. It is quite high up the agenda, but it's not anywhere near up there with
number
the
5,
NHS or the cost of living crisis. So the strategy for parties like Reform and before that the Brexit Party has always been to pin immigration to those other issues, to say immigration levels are the cause of the issues in the NHS or the cost of living crisis that you're facing.
Which is ridiculous, isn't it? I mean, actually, part of the problem is we don't have enough migrants to staff the NHS. Most migrants, nearly the vast majority, add to the exchequer. They spend more. They pay their taxes. And what was the other? It costs of living. That's Liz Truss, isn't it? Mainly Brexit and Liz Truss.
But
what do you make of it all, Hardeep?
But I think the truth is that Nigel Farage standing in Clacton has got nothing to do with Clacton.
Yeah.
And he was asked about the local issues facing the area. And he said, well, I admit I don't know what they are, but I think having a national figure representing a constituency like this might bring in some investment. This is more about it. Clacton is purely a vehicle for him to position himself to the right of the Conservative right, so that following an election in which the Conservatives are pretty much facing heavy defeat, he is going to push that side of politics even more to the right. I would argue it's going towards the MAGA-style Republicans. And that's what this is all about. It's not so much about this election. I mean, maybe he does want to be an MP and sort of maybe there's a chance of that. But really, it's about what's going to happen after the election and the leverage he wants. I mean, he even said, I don't need to defect to the Conservatives. It'd be much better if my party reformed, just like swallows
reverse takeover,
reverse engineering.
Yeah.
So that's what this is really about.
So he was a member of the Conservative Party, I believe, until about 2010, maybe 2000. Anyway, at some point, left mainly because of Europe. That was his banging agenda, UKIP, Independence Party. He was an MEP for, I think, 2 terms. Apparently never turned up to many of those debates about fishing. And any debate he did turn up, Russia Today, oddly enough, broadcast it. I don't know why that would happen. So Brexit's now gone, and he is focusing on being this insurgency. We should be clear, by the way, that a lot of the people who funded his Leave EU campaign also funded the Vote Leave campaign, are also Conservative donors. So there is a part of the Conservative Party, isn't there, which is always welcome. A look to Nigel Farage as a kind of lever. He's kind of your outrider. You push there over to the window, but look at Nigel Farage.
Exactly.
It doesn't look like whatever Farage has said, Stan, is going to affect Labour's vote much, does it? It's mainly going to Conservative vote.
No, exactly. I think something like Reform's current polling position, something like 7/8 of it gets taken from the Conservative Party vote. So it's a huge diversion away from the vote that the Conservatives would be going for. Whereas, and there's an interesting comparison here, I think, with, for example, the Green Party. They're often seen as just taking votes from Labour. Actually, most of the seat gains they've made in the past few years at council level have come from Conservatives.
Wow.
So they almost play a sort of encouraging role for Labour's chances of a majority, eating away often at Conservative votes and bringing out non-voters and things like that. So much less of a risk for Keir Starmer's party from the Greens than Reform for the Conservatives. So the Conservatives are playing this quite strange game where they're flagging so much in the polls. You see Reform take some of that vote, and then the Conservatives panic and think, okay, we need to shift further to the right. But then, of course, they're shedding voters to Labour at the same time.
Right.
So they're in a sort of death spiral, I think, at the moment. Not really quite clear where they can go from here.
And it's interesting, before we get to Hardeep, why she thinks this is happening and what it means for the Conservative Party. They are about the same level as the Lib Dems, aren't they? 15, 16%. But if on the current electoral first-past-the-post system, most they're likely to get is 3 seats. So it's not about Reform becoming a big party in Parliament. What do you think it's about, Hardeep? And how does that work for the future of conservatism in this country?
Well, I think UKIP was always primarily a pressure group led by Farage, and arguably it was very successful in that. I mean, he's had a huge influence on British politics in recent years. And I think he's aware of that. I think, as Josiah says, it's a very clever strategy to distance himself from his ultimate project, which was Brexit. So in Clacton, when he launched his campaign this week, there were several journalists asking him, I think it's Emily Maitlis of the Newsagents podcast, who said, so Clacton is poorer because of the implications of Brexit. And he wouldn't answer it. So it's not about Brexit.
Yes.
It's obviously talking about migration, and I would argue the dog whistles of that issue. But this is about, as I said, what's going to happen after the election. And it's interesting because Richard Tice was the leader of the Reform Party up until a week ago. And then obviously there's been this switch, and Farage has said that now he's leader and he's going to stand. The reason he had said that he wasn't looking to lead the party was because he wanted to go to America and help Donald Trump with the US presidential campaign. And we know, I mean, you've done a lot of work on this, Peter, the links between the Trumpist right and Nigel Farage and Aaron Banks and those individuals.
And they were out there in 2016.
They've been pictured together.
Yeah.
The politics is very closely linked. And so
Make Clacton great again.
Yeah,
Macca.
I really don't think I think what we're looking at is a heavy Conservative defeat.
Yeah.
And it'll be very interesting. I mean, I don't think the Conservative Party will stay in its current form, but I do think it will go further to the right. This is a man, Nigel Farage, who last week was on Sky News saying that an increasing number of Muslims in this country don't agree with British values. There's very little evidence to back that up. He was using a poll around
The Sun poll, that Sun
in
poll
Gaza.
about, yes, exactly.
And
completely.
I just feel that there's going to be a lot of focus on a expected big win for Labour. But I think at the same time, what we're likely to see is the beginnings of a mainstream far-right movement in Britain. And I think that's really worrying. I think there is a possibility we could be a decade behind America.
Yeah.
We can't take this stuff for granted. And so this development personally worries me.
And before we get into the finances of it, because one thing that Donald Trump is interested in, as we know from his media empire worth $5 billion, is financing. You know, American politics much more reliant on financing. You're listening to Byline Audio. We're dedicated to enriching the audio cultural landscape. Here, beyond our well-known political coverage and exclusive investigations, we aim to amplify unheard voices and sounds, taking you on a deeper journey into history, myth, humour, music, fashion and culture. For more ad-free and exclusive content, join us on bylineaudio.com.
Byline Audio.
And it's interesting, Farage chose not to go to America or not make that his priority. He could probably do both with an early election. He could still go to help Trump, because that's not until November, and the rallies, you know, the RNC, the caucus is not until August, I think, or maybe late July. Is that he is not only of that ideological value, he has also around in the Conservative Party other people who've shown a great interest in Trump, haven't they? So if we look at who could be his allies, if you like, in a refuck is their abbreviation, I don't mean to swear, was the abbreviation when they did Lib Dem, refuck, lab, con, and they think they've changed that now. It genuinely was. But if you had a reform conservative, a recon party, there's a couple who've already sort of shown their allegiance to Trump and speak highly of Farage with Jacob Rees-Mogg.
And conspiracies. I mean, Josiah, you reported on Liz Truss's latest antics.
Yeah, Liz Truss going on a far-right aligned podcast last week. I mean, it seems like she's been testing the water for whether that kind of politics works in the UK. And I think perhaps after electoral defeat for certain Tory figures, they might want to look into that as well. And obviously we've seen Boris Johnson cozy up to Donald Trump even after his conviction. So, yeah, it does seem to be a sort of growing trend. I mean, it's extremely debasing, really, isn't it? Looking across the pond and thinking, yeah, I want some of the highly
indicted criminals. So a key
Yeah.
figure in this, of course, we reported a lot about him because he's co-founder of Cambridge Analytica, Trump's campaign manager and editor of Breitbart, was Steve Bannon, who we reported was regularly in contact with Boris Johnson, appeared on TV at his show with Liz Truss, and has advised Jacob Rees-Mogg. So there is a pattern emerging there. So beyond the actual politics of MAGA or Make Britain MABA or whatever, no, MUBA, whatever it would be for the UK, let's look at some of the issues around finance, because we know in America, Trump, whenever he raises money off the back of an indictment or conviction. Nigel Farage, obviously UKIP wasn't his party. It was kind of a party he preceded, and he left after Brexit, and he formed his own party, the Brexit Party, which it's our early days, wasn't it, Hardeep? It was in the first 5 years of Byline Times. Here it is, on sale at all good magazine shops. And we report about the Brexit Party, which he set up for the Euro elections in 2019, and then the general election of late 2019. It was a money, not quite laundering. It was a bit of a scam how it was financed, wasn't it? Do you remember Man of the PayPal? Anybody could sign up with a foreign donor or whatever and contribute all this money and actually pay money to be selected as a candidate. It was awash with what the Electoral Commission saw as red flags. We got the Electoral Commission to look at it. With Reform, it's even more complicated, isn't it? Reform is not a political party, it's a company.
Yeah, I mean, it is both. It's a very strange entity. It's officially a limited company. Nigel Farage owns 53% of the shares in that company. Richard Tice holds a minority stake, and there's a few others as well. It is also, I mean, to stand, you need to be registered with the Electoral Commission as well. But the Electoral Commission doesn't say you need to, for example, have any sort of internal elections for your leaders. So it was quite interesting when Nigel Farage took over as leader last week, because there was almost no conversation about how he was chosen for that.
Well, he must have chosen himself because he's the major shout.
He's the major shout. He has, he's literally listed as having a commanding state, a person of significant control, as they call it, in Company's House. So he could just say, sorry, Tice, you're out of here. I'm the new head honcho in this place. So,
Tice seems to be happy with this. He turned up at the rally. I can see that Aaron Banks, who financed the EVU Farage campaign, was very happy that he was there. And so there's no membership. Nobody can vote on whether he's in or out. There is funding, I think, from quite a wealthy businessman to help underpin the party. And they're having problems selecting candidates. When you write to them, what was your last communication from Richard Tice, maybe, Josiah? Not the favourite person at Reform, Refuck UK.
Well, I did ask for an interview because I think that there's an interesting, perhaps slightly strange route for supporters of proportional representation in this country, which is that if perhaps in the parliament after this one, the Conservatives get a hung parliament, minority government, a few Reform MPs might insist on a switch to a different voting system.
Or just to put it out, their current poll ratings, which is the same as the Lib Dems as an overall, because of the first past the post and where those votes are, they'd get 3 MPs and the Dems would get 60. So you can see there's a question of fairness there too.
Yeah, absolutely. So in the spirit of open-mindedness, I asked for an interview and came back quite quickly with the reply, Josiah, I will not be doing any interviews or helping Byline Times at all since you're trying to kill us. Slightly paraphrased.
Richard, we don't want to kill you.
We
just want some transparency and openness. They've had, the other problem why he might say that is we've detected quite a few of his candidates which seem to be selected at haste, have made rather dubious remarks.
I mean, to be honest, it's not like Byline Times has had a strategy of finding racist reform candidates. It's more you just pluck a few from the list, dig into some social media feeds, and it's fairly rich pickings, I have to say. So, there's been no strategy to kill reform. They do make it quite easy. I mean, some would say we're performing a helpful role for all political parties in helping to vet their candidates. The nomination deadline hasn't closed, but I'm sure there'll be some more stories coming out after that as well.
And we've looked at Lib Dem candidates, a Lib Dem councillor, online presence, Welsh Labour. It's not like we're looking for where there are stories or where there are questionable behaviours, and we don't just look at one party, we look at them all.
That's exactly, without fear or favour.
Without fear or favour, we're not partisan, except towards the truth.
And when it comes to holding our media to account, and there's another issue here with the announcement of Farage standing in Clacton, but also becoming leader of Reform. I mean, the disproportionate amount of coverage he's been given by mainstream broadcasters, unfortunately, primarily led by the BBC, the Daily Mail, the Telegraph, they're always going to splash on him. But when you've got the BBC homepage that leads with a big picture of him and what he said in Clacton, because as Josiah has pointed out in his reports, the Greens have, 800 council seats across the England? And
8.
Reform has 8. So even on a local level, it's not like they've been electorally successful. So why is there so much representation of them in the media? But this comes to the central problem of Farage's performative entertainment politics. He makes good copy.
Yes.
He says things which are sound bites,
like
good headlines, there's always a cigarette. I mean, unfortunately, this week he had a milkshake thrown in his face, which I don't personally condone at all, because I think once you start saying that certain politicians in the public eye are open for assault, that's very, very dangerous. But the point is, he is a character. Yeah. He's a character.
Good copy.
And this was the same thing that was going on 10 years ago. And it doesn't seem to me that the broadcasters, the media, have been able to learn the lessons and approach him in a proportionate way. So what happens is he ends up setting the agenda with speeches about migration, or because in a way, I think, especially the likes of the BBC, they kind of see him as the real opposition to an expected Labour Party victory. And that in itself is problematic. And
poor journalism, isn't it? Because it's a bit like the climate change issue, where the BBC Today programme got somebody believed in man-made climate change and somebody didn't, for balance, whereas 97% of scientists believe it is happening, right? Whereas with Farage, to oppose, why him? Why not a Green? Why not SNP? Why does it always have to be Farage which opposes this anti-establishment figure who went to Dulwich School. So just as we sort of wind up on this subject of Farage, all this airtime devoted to his statements and this very unfortunate apology by the BBC. After that, those remarks about Muslims being not British values. I think a presenter BBC cut to say these inflammatory remarks as she was coming out of the broadcast and was forced to an on-air apology, which I feel you should not apologise for the truth. And there was a mistaken idea because he wasn't running as a candidate then, that under the Representation of the People's Act, she shouldn't have. That's not true. So there's this kind of caution the BBC has. One story they haven't followed is his finances, or rather particularly his main financier friend is a guy called George Cottrell. Do you guys know much about him, or do I have to explain?
No, you should explain, Peter. I think you're the expert on this one.
I'm sorry. You asked me questions about it. Let's reverse it.
Who is he?
Well, George Cottrell is a young aristocrat who is known as Posh George, and he was particularly in the run-up to Brexit 2000. He was kind of an aide-de-camp, Nigel Farage's finance man. Nigel says he loves him like a son. The problem was when they were going to the Republican National Conference in 2016, which Farage met Steve Bannon and Roger Stone. It's quite a big moment where you see the collision of Brexit and Trump. This is just after the Brexit vote. He was arrested by the FBI and indicted and imprisoned for money laundering, blackmail, various charges, I think 20 federal charges, and did some kind of plea deal. So after 6 months. Very interestingly, and this is something Carol Cadwallader and I uncovered in those famous contentious emails of Arron Banks to the Russian embassy, including Andy Wigmore, his head of communications. When the indictments came in from the federal authorities in the US, they immediately, Wigmore sent them to the Russian embassy. You'll be interested in this. So very strange goings on. Since then, Posh George, and I know people who know him, he's a very entertaining character and quite a colourful character. Lost 6 million betting at some casino recently. Also was involved in this, I don't know, probably he'll deny any nefarious involvement, was caught up in some scam in Macedonia with Bitcoin and money laundering. So he was there, the guy leading Farage away from the milkshake incident. I find that really annoying. I mean, do you remember the DCMS committee interrogating Murdoch about phone hacking, and some idiot goes and puts a pie in his face, which really interrupted things. But George Cottrell was there. And nobody, except the Daily Beast in America and a bit in the Observer with me, Carol Cadwallader, has looked at this. Because it does connect back to others. So he used to write this Investors Chronicle Farage, which has been heavily criticised. He had these connections in Malta with strange groups that in all that endless acres of airtime, nobody asked him about this. Nobody asked him about Russia Today. Nobody asked him about meeting the Russian ambassador. I mean, what's going on there?
I think a problem is that journalists quite like to laugh with Farage. They go along a lot of the time, I think, with his sort of comedian shtick. And as you say, when was the last time you saw a genuinely interrogating interview with Nigel Farage? Either he's not asked to do them, or he just doesn't do them. I mean, of course, he's got his own show on GB News. He'll go to the pub where he'll invite broadcasters and he'll do a few questions each. But really, how many journalists have properly quizzed him about his finances, about the true impact of Brexit? In the end, you just end up with media figures laughing along with him. And as Hardeep touched on before, I think for broadcasters and for print news outlets, they're sort of addicted to the eyeballs that someone like Nigel Farage brings, whether it's to websites or to TV programmes, rather than any serious scrutiny of him, I think.
Again, it's that reductionist politics and journalism. So we're way past the point of any nuance or complexity or contradiction. So the leadership debates are one example of that with that format. And then another problem is this politics and entertainment.
Right, politainment.
Yeah. And so in a way, like Josiah says, stick Farage on the front page. And there's a perception that that is something that people are interested in. I mean, that's different from the public interest in what he says and the proportionality around the gravitas of it. But there's a notion that, oh, well, people want things that are easy and quickly understood. And what happens in that? that is it just contributes to the decay of our public discourse.
And he's very good at playing that affable guy with the beer and the cigar. And surely, at least when it comes to news sites, they can see the clicks. They obviously have some justification of believing his good copy. But a very good point, Hardeep, about what the public are interested in is not the same as the public interest. We know when they found out, all the readers, News of the World, the top-selling tabloid, 168 years old, top-selling English tabloid, when they discovered how those salacious stories all about murdered schoolgirls actually came about, when they saw the sausage being made, they want to drop it like a hot iron. In a way, if people knew how reform was made, that sausage was made, how this kind of politics, maybe if the journalist informed them, it's a bit like on packaging, I think. If you know what's in that sausage, the numbers, you can eat it happily and you get ill and you get tired. But when somebody points out what's in the sausage, and there surely is a duty.
You think,
maybe, and the consumers, just because the consumers like it doesn't mean it's good.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's been something that has long been an issue with journalism in this country. I also think there's a notion here that the journalists and the editors themselves, enough of them felt that this election campaign was quite boring.
Ah, right, because it's a fixed
quite
outcome
boring.
at the moment. Yeah,
Sunak's out on his own, out on a limb.
20-point lead.
And then Farage enters the fray. And so again, we've got to remember who the gatekeepers are to the public discourse. It's the journalists and the editors, and enough of them, and this was a problem, unfortunately, with Laura Kuenssberg, who was a political editor during Brexit and the pandemic. The gatekeepers, their opinions matter, the how they're viewing these politicians and their relationship to power matters. And so if enough editors
think his good copy is fine.
I mean, he's on the, Metro is just like a free sheet handed out, read by commuters. But that milkshake incident's on the front page. It's good copy, it's a bit of drama in the election campaign, which is otherwise a bit dull. Right. Why is that even a relevant consideration? It's just all this stuff needs to be unpicked a bit more,
It's the treating of him, I think, as a comedian. It's exactly that, Hardeep. It's like there's a refusal to take him on as what he is, which is a very divisive politician. And I think if you don't have that smile on his face, start looking actually at the genuine impact he's had through the Brexit referendum and everything else, then I think the kind of coverage we'd get would be very different.
So that's where his great pal, I'm not sure how great a pal he is, Donald Trump, because somehow the mask has slipped there. Now people aren't laughing anymore at Donald Trump's performance. And if they saw a bit more of Nigel Farage's, they might not. And the interesting thing is that it was revealed this week, partly because after the indictments, he lost some values off the shares. Donald Trump's media business is $5 billion, much more than I think he's ever actually made from property. So maybe there's an element of, we saw this Carl Benjamin, the saga, who was that show. It's not his platform. Liz Truss appeared on. Looks like he's got almost $1 million in the bank. It's very profitable to go down these culture wars, worldwide wrestling model. Not for us, though.
But one thing, it's always nice to end on a more positive note, because I've been pointing out problematic features of the journalism and the politics in the campaign this week. But there was one moment that if people haven't viewed it, I would recommend. So it was an ITV interview with the leader of the Liberal Democrats, Ed Davey. And the clip's been doing the rounds on social media, Twitter. It was put out by ITV. And care is a big issue for the Lib Dems. And they have pledged and be in their manifesto that they want to give personal allowances, financial packages to people who have to care for relatives. And he was talking about this to the interviewer on ITV and talking about his son, who is severely disabled, and him and his wife look after him. I won't say much more about it because you really need to watch it.
Right.
It was an incredibly human, poignant moment, which I think is actually what politics is about. You really saw Ed Davey as a person. This isn't about the politics. It's just in that moment, he was talking about how he lost his mother quite young. And it was just a really human moment, and also explained where his commitment to that policy comes from, why that is so important to him and for the Lib Dems. And that was just a moment of, this is what both journalism and politics could illuminate. And I just encourage everyone, if they haven't seen it, it's about 2 minutes. Do go and watch it. It's on the ITV News Twitter.
Well, maybe we'll feature that in the forthcoming edition of The Moment in our next print edition of Byline Times, which we're heading towards as we zoom towards an election. Yeah, we're not a huge media corporation like Donald Trump. You support us partly by buying Byline Times, and you can sign up to TV membership and audio membership. Thank you, Hardeep, and thank you, Josiah, for entertaining me, certainly, for the last hour or so. I hope you've been informed and entertained. We'll be back probably this Friday. We're trying to play it by ear if we feel right. Adam's a bit under the weather, so maybe Adam being comfortable join us. We'll keep you posted. If more happens, we'll try to cover stuff which is relevant rather than just fill your ears and your eyes just because we have to. And meanwhile, thanks for listening, and see you again very, very soon.